Hello. So nice to see so many of you here and popping on as we go. Um, my name is Jonathan Hulting-Cohen. I recognize some of your faces and some of your names and some not so much, so just a brief introduction. My name is Jonathan Hulting-Cohen. I am currently the assistant professor of saxophone at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. And before that, I studied, great fortune of studying with Donald Sinta at the University of Michigan for my undergraduate and master's degrees, after which point I transitioned to UMass. Um, I've been teaching at UMass for 6 years now, and I'm getting ready to submit my tenure file, which I'm relieved to be doing. Um, and that it's typically the tenure file at UMass anyway is submitted in the sixth year. And I'm actually submitting during my seventh year. And the reason for that is that I had an injury in my first year. So in my first year at UMass, I ended up with a concussion. And this concussion caused me to miss about a year of school. And so I wasn't able to teach or play for most of that year. Started coming back very slowly in January um, in a very kind of haphazard way. But over time, the lessons from that experience have really stuck with me. And um, as I think about today's topic, building and rebuilding a mindful music practice, um, yeah, I'm reminded of that experience and others like it that I've had that have caused me to evaluate and reevaluate my relationship to music, my relationship to practicing, my relationship to the saxophone, and to identities as are wrapped up in all of that. Um, so just a little bit of that story about the concussion was I had been when I was appointed to this position, I was 25 years old, and I had a lot of um, kind of anxiety about having something to prove. Being such a young person, um, not having a doctorate, I think that was a big thing for me, um, and having suddenly a lot more responsibility than I'd ever really experienced, um, trying to work with students and shepherd them through their undergraduate and graduate degrees. And at the same time, being on the tenure track, I felt a lot of pressure to produce. We hear a lot of these publish or perish kinds of sayings, sink or swim, or and there's a lot right there at the beginning to adjust to. And I'm a co-founder of the Saxophone Sextet, the Moaning Frogs, and that group at that time was based in Ann Arbor, Michigan. And I was also playing with a saxophone and harp duo, um, the Admiral Launch duo, which was also based in Ann Arbor, Michigan. These were all groups that I had co-founded while I was a student, and then had moved out east, and then had to figure out how to work with again going forward. And I, I, you know, I had gone out to Michigan to go to a friend's wedding. This friend was Joe DeLeo, who some of you may know from the U.S. Coast Guard Band. And Joe's wedding was happening, and I was trying to figure out how to go to Joe's wedding and how to rehearse with the Moaning Frogs and rehearse with Jennifer, the harpist. And also, I had a girlfriend there at the time, and I was trying to figure out how to see her. And based on the my experience in grad school around mindfulness practice, which I had really geared towards efficiency around my practice session as my main goal, juggling a lot of things in grad school, but very different things than as a professor. Um, I thought, well, if I'm just hyper efficient, it will all work out. And it didn't. I was exhausted by the time I got to the wedding. And I was on stage. Some of you were there. I was on stage, and because the wedding was at the Fox Theater in Detroit, and I was on stage, part of the wedding party, and all of a sudden I start feeling something, and I pass out, and I hit my head, go down hard on a speaker cabinet, and that landed me with a concussion, which I didn't know yet. It was a very dramatic moment. I think some orthodontist or dentist came to the rescue, and then after that, the medics came and checked me out, and Joe and Charlotte got married with half of my body hanging off the stage, which was, um, if it was funny actually because I thought I was fine. I thought I was totally fine. The medic said, "Well, you can stay if you want, or you can go if you want. It doesn't matter. You may have a mild concussion. It's no big deal." And I'd been working hard and wanted to celebrate, so I stayed and I danced the whole night. The next morning, I woke up and I went with my girlfriend to a contra dance, and I danced again, and I started feeling weird. Flew back to Massachusetts and saw a doctor in the morning, and they said, "Well, you may have a mild concussion, but the thing is, if you if you you just lay off of your exercise for a little bit, it should go away and you should be fine." Well, the laying off the exercise was fine, except that in my mindset of hyper accomplishment, of trying to do everything, I think what that meant to me as part of actually part of a mindfulness practice that I'd already established was, well, maybe let's just not exercise till Friday. So I took 4 days off and I did a small run, and by the time I got back, I was really quite walloped. And I tried to go back to school. The doctor said, you really probably shouldn't do that. If you do, it'll take you longer, but you'll still recover. And the issue that I found was within a few weeks, it was impossible for me to go back to school. I found also that I was really reluctant to give up a lot of my concert engagements, few as they were at the beginning of my academic career, with staring at an empty CV and the publisher perish in front of me or behind me, depending on the day. Um, it was really something I didn't want to give up. So I found myself a few weeks later not teaching, but on a plane to go to Ann Arbor to perform a concerto with the Ann Arbor Concert Band, which I achieved with the help of a chair behind me in case I passed out again. And so, I say all this to say, in graduate school, I had these mindfulness practices. I had developed them through a meditation class that I took and some other coursework. And I thought that my mindfulness practice was going very well, that it would be able to um, carry me through changes and transitions. And when I got here and tried to be a good teacher and not be a jerk because I wasn't sleeping enough, and just um, also perform at a high level, I found that my practice was actually quite rigid. And it was very difficult to reset that. And I think it took this kind of a crisis for me to realize that um, that some flexibility is required, and that perhaps it's also easy to become attached to a mindfulness practice. So I thought it might be useful to throw out a established definition of mindfulness, and also my own experience with it and my own um, sort of personal definition for myself, in case any of this means anything to any of you. So mindfulness, I think its roots are, as far as I can understand it, through Buddhism, and it's also found in other um, spiritual and religious traditions, excuse me. Um, but I think the popularized version of mindfulness does come fairly explicitly out of Buddhism. It's an ancient tradition, and there's a lot of specific practices that are tied to that. And then in 1979, a man by the name of John Kabat-Zinn at the University of Massachusetts Medical School in Worcester, Mass, started sort of a secularized version of this. And there are these programs, mindfulness-based stress reduction, mindfulness-based cognitive therapy, that have had a lot of scientific study done on them for the positive effects that they can have on trauma, on quality of life, on anxiety, on a lot of things that affect regular people, and also those of us wizards who play saxophone and who play music. So some of those words may resonate with you as well. And John Kabat-Zinn has a very concise definition of mindfulness, which he derives from the Chinese symbol for the word mindfulness, and that is presence of heart, H-E-R-T, H-E-A-R-T. So this is something that I think is often at odds with um, either a learned or absorbed or something definition of perfection, which is what I have been striving for in my classical performance career and development. And thinking about heartfulness as part of the music practice is something, not to get off topic, but I'm thinking back to earlier in the series. Zach Sheeman did a presentation on, I think it was, what would you call it? Uh, like reasons for playing, inspiration, motivation. Maybe it was motivation, and he had several different models, and each one had different levels, and several of them dealt with some kind of love as one of the higher levels of um, motivation. Um, and so I think that this idea of heartfulness as separate from maybe kind of a quantitative perfection is something that has been really interesting for me to dive into personally, for something for me to work through, for me to realize, that there's a certain perfection maybe that comes with things that are actually heartful. Um, that keeping the heart in the music, even if the music is extremely avant-garde, is it extremely cerebral, um, I think heartfulness can look really different in different contexts. I don't think we can do ourselves any favors by defining heartfulness as bel canto style, um, but you can have a lot of heart when you play all kinds of different things. For example, I just watched that brilliant Nick Zulik performance about an hour ago. Um, that had a lot of heart. I thought that was awesome. And also, I watched the Chamber Music Society of Lincoln Center online and live, and there's a lot of heart there, and there's a lot of heart in all different contexts. So mindfulness for John Kabat-Zinn is presence of heart. For me, it's knowing how I feel and what I think at any given time. And this has pretty significant implications for music practice, both in terms of just my willingness to do it at all, and also for the specific practice strategies that I use at any given time based on ideally my own assessment and of how I'm feeling, how I'm doing, how my head is, how my heart is, how my body is, um, and connecting to that. Um, so it can be, as I just to tie back to the graduate school, when I was in graduate school and I was preoccupied with the efficiency, the reason that I have transitioned more than having a concussion is that I found that to be quite fickle and quite brittle, that approach. Um, and I think that the heartfulness has been a really beautiful transition for me. Not one that I can claim to have made fully, but one that I'm glad to be wrestling with. And the concussion really leveled for me any notion of efficiency. I mean, I was out for almost an entire year. Um, I wasn't allowed to play. I had to wear polarized sunglasses all the time. Being a musician and not being able to hear loud noises or even quiet noises was really distressing. And I think I had a lot of my identity tied up with my ability to perform. My performance level was quite related to self-esteem. And that also is a wonderful, wonderfully powerful motivator, just as much as love. I think that might be level one from the schema that Zach Sheeman recommended or described was kind of fear-based. And it was quite effective in certain ways. And I found it wholly insufficient for when my conditions changed. Um, so that's not to say that also that fear-based practicing or the kind of mindfulness techniques that I had developed for myself in graduate school were misguided. Rather, I would say that they were built for what I needed at the time. They really did serve me quite well. I was very efficient. I learned a lot of music. I got a lot better at the saxophone over the course of my graduate degree. Um, but the concussion really signaled like a new normal for me. And I don't know if that's something people can relate to now. I mean, we are having these workshops because of the coronavirus and the pandemic. And I felt like that concussion for me was sort of ushering in a new paradigm, or at least clarifying the need for a new paradigm for me in terms of my teaching, in terms of my responsibilities. And the point with all of that is the comes back to the title of this workshop, which is building and rebuilding a mindful practice, a mindful music practice. And I built it in grad school. It kind of worked then, and then after the concussion, I needed to build it again. And after, I found this several times so far in my career, the need to build and rebuild. And I think that this really comes down to all different levels. Whether we're talking about building and rebuilding mindfully in response to a crisis or a major change in our surroundings or in our personal lives, um, but also on a daily level. And this is where mindfulness for me comes in, is the awareness of where I am and being able to adjust and come back to some practices that I know. Now, those um, practices sometimes can be very simple. They can be something like long tones, which, if we are familiar enough with how to do them and just simply do them, I think we can find, at least I can find, a lot of comfort in playing long tones. Not just in the precision of them, but also in just the routine of it. There's something soothing about repetition. Um, and any other things that we might have as part of our regular music practice. And this kind of brings up another kind of takeaway for me from going back and reflecting on this, is that for me, I think I've learned that personally, discipline is the courage to show up again, even when it gets tough. There's that saying, when it gets tough, the tough get going. Okay, yes, absolutely. I think it's true. And I think that this is one case of that. I think that saying also kind of has some baggage for me personally, especially with the kind of um, I have trouble personally relating to what I perceive to be kind of a macho energy involved there. Um, but at the same time, I think that the discipline is a big deal, um, and not in sort of a whip kind of way. Get your ass back in that practice room. I think that's one way to do it, but another way to do it is to love yourself back into the practice room and say, you know what, here we go again. And kind of sucks and it's kind of great, and it just also just is the practice session it's going to be. Maybe there isn't such a thing as a great practice session or a terrible practice session. Maybe there is a thing as a mindful practice session, or maybe a less mindful practice session. Maybe. I would probably have to think about that a little bit more. But the courage to show up again, I think, is a big deal. And I'm certainly finding that to be a big challenge during the pandemic. Um, a lot of things have changed for me, just as they did during the concussion, or just even with the move, even without the medical significance. A lack of friends, a lack of sort of isolation, a sort of disconnection. As much as I love being alone, which I wouldn't trade my alone time for hardly anything, I really value the other people in my life. And even just the casual interactions in the hallway, or with students, or with faculty, or friends, or this kind of thing. And it can be a lot to have the courage to show up, um, whether that's because of those changes or because yesterday's practice session, or last week's practice session, as the case may be, last month's practice session, the last time we touched it didn't sound that great. Um, so for me, carrying on, out of the concussion, I definitely needed a new relationship with the saxophone, which was, of course, there was a need for even greater efficiency in a certain kind of sense because I had more responsibility. But at the same time, I knew that the motivation had to shift, or it wasn't going to be sustainable for a career. Um, I hope this is a long career for me, and if it is, I don't think I can keep working at that furious pace. So I actually enrolled in an MBSR program. That's a mindfulness-based stress reduction program, which comes out of that John Kabat-Zinn secularized mindfulness practice, and it's an 8-week program um, where you practice some specific mindfulness strategies. Um, some of these are just simple awareness, body awareness. So there's a practice called a body scan where you might, if you'd like to try it with me now, it's very simple. You can just sit wherever you are or stand still. And the first part of this is to just notice your breath. And even that can have just tremendous impact on the saxophone playing. I remember the breathing gym. I don't know how many of you remember the breathing gym or use the breathing gym. I love the breathing gym. Um, but my recollection of the breathing gym is like, it's like all this great, like in for 12, out for 37 and a half, this kind of stuff. And it's phenomenal and it's great and it totally works. But what I find is like, if I go inside and I just pay attention to the breath, I find that other muscles relax. And as other muscles relax, more space increases for the air at all to go in and then to come out into the saxophone. But that aside, just from a mindfulness perspective, paying attention to the breath, going down, finding the toes. You can wiggle them if you want, but then leave them there. How many do you have? Can you feel them all? Come up over the tops and bottoms of your feet, your ankles. How about your calves, your knees? And as we're doing this, are maybe I'm being a little bit of a tension sleuth. So I'm looking for anything that I might be holding a little bit tightly. And then into my upper legs, my hips, my back, my front, my shoulders, my neck, my head, my eyebrows, my musculature in my face. Well, here we'll call it the embouchure. So your embouchure, how's your embouchure? Corners in, no, just corners wherever they are. Um, and then this is really interesting practice of, can you notice in breathing, maybe if you're not stuffed up, you can breathe through your nose and notice, can you feel that like plane of contact where the air goes right into your nose? And we're not changing anything, we're just listening and just trying to feel where that happens. And this took about a minute. And this is something I like to do at the beginning of practice. And so, you can come out of that and then transition into whatever it is on your agenda for the day. At least this is what I do. So I try to set a timer for a minute at the beginning of my practice. And I calm, maybe do a body scan. And then I get ready to play. So I think that these, another thing that is helpful to me is paying attention to the mind. So during that, is my mind racing? Is it going over here? Is it jumping around? That is a really common one for me. You may have even heard that in my speech as I was talking to you. I'm in the middle of my body scan and I'm thinking about all the ways that it applies to breathing. And it's like, okay, well, or we could just do a body scan and that would be fine. So, this jumping around sometimes is referred to monkey brain and referred to as monkey brain. And when I notice I have that, in the past, I would try to like corral the monkey, put the monkey in a cage. Well, it doesn't work so well. My cage is very small. The monkey gets very angry. It starts banging on the bars, making a lot of noise, and it's very hard to concentrate. So my idea is how can I expand my awareness enough to accommodate monkey brain? And then with monkey brain, how do I work with that throughout the course of a practice session? So here's a strategy that I will often employ um, for expanding the awareness around the monkey brain. Um, and this also is hybridized from the MBSR program, but it's kind of my own take on it. Other people also probably have done something exactly the same, so I lay no claim. Um, so this is it's something I just casually to myself refer to as the five senses, where we go through listening first, and then, well, I guess it doesn't really matter the order, although I like to use sight last. So listening, feeling, tasting. So what are they? Listen, hearing, tasting, touching, seeing, and smelling. So let's start with smell. So, I'll just close my eyes and just breathe and try to smell. Often the smells are quite neutral because we've been in a space for a while. But if we change spaces, that's when we notice the smell. So that's one of the, interesting things about trying to smell now. Like, what does it smell like? Is it musty? Is it fragrant? Do you have a Christmas tree? Is there a candle? Uh, do you need to do your laundry? Have you not showered for? I mean, what is the smell of right now? And it could be any number of things. Um, and it doesn't matter what it is, but just, and sometimes they're kind of indescribable, and there's no real point in describing them other than if it helps train your brain on what is there. Taste is interesting. We usually taste things that we put in our mouths. So, if you had something like a raisin, you could pop that in and try to taste it very slowly and see what that tastes like. Or you can actually see what your mouth tastes like, which is maybe a little strange. I find it um, challenging because, again, the way your mouth tastes under most circumstances is the definition, I think, probably of what neutral is for most of us. Um, so I think it's still interesting to just try to train the attention on the tongue and what it might be experiencing. Maybe it's taste, maybe it's not. And then the next thing that I would do is I would move over to touch. And I love this one. This one is okay, so let me see if I can feel my clothes on my skin. Let me see if I can feel my feet in my slippers at this moment, or socks. Can I feel my feet in my socks in my shoes? Can I feel the ground? What does it mean to feel the ground under your feet? Well, I mean, there's a certain weight, there's a certain resistance, and at the same time, I feel actually I'm feeling the wooden floor under me, and between that, there's all these other layers. There's a squishiness of the shoe. There's a scratchiness maybe of a sock, or a super comfortable sock would feel really different. And so there are these kind of layers to perception of something as simple as like feel your feet on the floor. It's like, well, there's about like 4 or 5 quite literal layers before you even get to the floor. And so, what does it mean to have your feet on the floor? We don't need to contemplate this to the end of time, but I do think we can hone our perceptions to be able to say, to determine what component of what I'm feeling is what part of what's there. And I think that question is super applicable to music learning and music practice and learning of a piece or even scales and things like that. So there we are with feeling, and then we're going to go for listening, of course, the crown skill of the musician. Um, and if I have time, what I'm interested in is listening long enough until I have found a sound in maybe all 4 quadrants around my head. So can I hear something to the front left, the front right, the right rear, the left rear? And the reason for that is it forces me to deal with time and it forces me to deal with patience. And, John Cage, of course, was interested in, among many other people, sort of random sounds and the music of that. And I think as a musician, it can be really interesting to try to make sense of all of the things around us. And also, it can be really interesting to just not make any sense of them whatsoever and just listen and just hear them there. Here's one here, one over there, one over there. I think the making sense of is a critical, crucial skill, and at the same time, it's quite limiting because it makes us see things through a very particular lens. And maybe if we hear something else, we're not actually as open to what's being made. Now, we may not have as great depth of perception. Let's say it is, maybe this is the difference between teaching and playing. Maybe in teaching, we have our cone of shame. No, our cone of what do you call it? Kind of um, standards or culture or something around that we're listening for in the context around the music that we're hearing. And as performers, of course we bring that with us, but maybe we also need to actually really be able to hear what's going on around us, or maybe we find ourselves in an unusual musical situation, or we'd like to. Maybe a lot of us who are classical players wanting to play jazz run into this problem. We've worked so hard on this that we miss this one, and it's quite a struggle. And so I've worked through these four different senses, and then after maybe hearing these pings like radar around my head, maybe then I'll open my eyes and I'll see. Now, this is where it's really important, I think, to just receive the light. So just see, there are things on my desk, and some of them are bigger than others, some are different colors than others, some of them are deeper than others, some of them make sound, some of them make light, some of them, are square, some are round, some are um, very modernistic and futuristic looking, some are very old school, some are natural materials, some are synthetic materials, some are very expensive, some are very inexpensive. There are all these different qualities about the things that are in front of us that normally I just say, that's my desk. And that's my desk is great if I'm going to sit down and do something else. But if I'm practicing perception and I want to be able to take that into particularly chamber music, but also into solo playing and practicing and further deepening analysis, after we've reached a certain level of proficiency, there's always more digging to do. And I think kind of removing some of those filters and seeing things for their component abstract parts can be quite interesting and quite illuminating. Um, so that's a practice that takes a little bit longer than a minute, and I don't do that in conjunction with my practice. But that brings me to another area of mindfulness that I find really useful is this distinction between formal and informal practice. Formal practice would be something like what I just described, that concerted five-step process, or even the body scan, which you can do in a minute, or you can do it in a much more detailed, longer form way. Um, Informal practice is the application of that in context. And this is something that most of us are extraordinarily familiar with, having spent so many hours and days and weeks and months and years playing scales. Scales are a formal practice, and most of us play scales simply to play scales, although it's a nice mindset to have while we're there. The function of scales is to be able to have the kind of refined technique that we need to play the music that we want to play, so that when we need to work on um, balance of tone within a passage, it's there, or even fingers, or quickness, or slowness, or connection between notes, or intonation. We've already worked on it, so not every passage requires a monumental effort if we've abstracted it to its basic components, such as this one is square, this one is round, this one is natural, this one is man-made or fabricated in some way. That kind of abstraction is a direct parallel for me in my practice to scales versus repertoire. So the formal practice I described a few formal practices that I employ for myself. In addition to, I try to practice meditation. The cool thing about the pandemic is that I found online groups to practice meditation with, and that has been really cool, to just be around other people. That's one of the things about being a professor, is that I no longer have, let me see here, who's here? Zach Stern, Dan Grazer, um, I don't know, you know, uh, from my college days down the hall, practicing to kind of feel like I'm part of a community of people who is really all working on this. Um, so I credit them, of course, these two and all the others with my musical development during grad school as much as mindfulness, as much as anything, as much as my teacher. But that formal practice in community can be really nice. Yet again, another thing I appreciate about these Zoom sessions. So let's see here. The informal application of these practices can be something as simple as uh, you know while practicing scales, paying attention to hand position. Okay, so we're working on body scans. In I'm working on body. Let's say I'm working on a body scan at the beginning of each practice session, and I'm already clued into how does my body feel? Well, I may be paying attention to my toes, and at some point my fingers, but at some point, we all talk about and work on hand position as practitioners of this instrument. Um, and so my brain is already kind of drawing on that channel for what's my hand doing? How is it while I'm doing this thing? And one level is just simply having it on my lap. Another thing is, what does it feel like when they're on the keys? And then what does it feel like when I'm moving them on the keys? And how about when I'm going fast? How about when I'm going slow? How about when I play triplets? Um, and really paying attention to that. Um, and that's something that is part of regular saxophone pedagogy anyway. You know, pay attention. Keep your hands on the pearls. Feel the pearls, man. Feel the pearls. Put a penny between your finger. Like, you have to be so mindful if you put a penny between your finger and the key so that you don't lift your finger off too far and the thing falls down and hits your saxophone and makes a big sound. You will notice. So these are all concentration tools, and mindfulness is just another way to practice this both outside and then bring it back to these other things that you probably are already doing, and many of you may have mindfulness practices anyway. Um, Another thing that I find applicable in terms of informal practice is, let's say, um, well, okay, let's keep working with scales. So with scales, we can do the body scan and connect that to the hands. We can use the other senses in terms of feeling. What is the feeling of when I transition into the altissimo? Is something changing? Is something not changing when I get there? What is the difference between this kind of overtone issue and a pure sound? And how do I make that distinction? We're talking about awareness of the oral cavity to be able to know what to do when we get to these different parts of our scales. Um, and that is only going to be augmented by general body awareness um, beyond simply in the practice room, although, of course, it can be developed there too. Another one would be listening. So we've already developed, we're working on listening in general. What happens then after you practice this for a few weeks, practice this 5-step um, sensory thing, and then you go to play? Are you perhaps any more clued into what's going on? Are you hearing things in your playing that maybe you didn't hear before? I find for myself that that is usually the case. It's usually the case. And so other strategies for focus, practicing. So if I have monkey brain, um, I'll try to use one of these awareness expanding capacity exercises in order to accommodate that monkey brain. The other thing that I'll do practically in terms of applying that monkey brain, sending it to good use, is I will set timers. So I'm a big fan of timers these days. I use a nice timer called the Insight timer, which has a bunch of different bell sounds. And so I set it for, if I'm working with a really hyperactive monkey brain, I'll set it for maybe 5 minutes. And I'll just try to decide very clearly what I'm going to do for those 5 minutes. I do it, and then and I do it until the timer stops, and then I stop. And then I either do it again for 5 minutes, or I change my focus, And I do that again, do that for 5 minutes. And if I feel like it's going, like my concentration could extend a bit, I'll go 10 minutes, maybe 7 minutes, 10 minutes. If I feel like my monkey brain is settling down, I'll go for a full session. And for me, a full session is 25 minutes. I do 25 minutes on, 5 minutes off. This is called the Pomodoro technique. It's a well established technique for concentration and for work in general. Um, I find it really useful and it helps me define exactly what it is I'm working on, which again is another way of paying attention to what am I working on right now? Where is my mind? Where is my body? What am I trying to do right now? There's so many things. It's easy to get overwhelmed in a practice session, at least for me, that I find these kinds of clear definitions to be very useful. And the other thing that I think is quite interesting is to, when it comes to breaking down the parameters of music into kind of component parts, like this exercise of absorbing the visual material or the sensory input as sensory input rather than with labels, um, is that I find a lot of value in going through maybe a passage or a piece of music, um, looking for very specific things and not really focusing so much on almost anything else. So one common way of doing this is looking at formal analysis. So of course, where is the loudest part of the piece? Where is the quietest part of the piece? How do they relate to each other? And then what is all that stuff in the middle, the gray zone of mezzo forte, mezzo piano? How about this one? How about that one? Stephen Banks gave a great tabito workshop. I thought that was wonderful. That can be very useful and applicable on a micro level, of course, and also dealing with larger forms. Um, but we can also do that with articulation. So let's look at how the articulation shifts over the course of maybe a page. Um, how is it in Ibers? There's a lot of slurring, and then the staccatos happen at very specific points. There's specific places where there's only one articulation at the end of a beat. What is the function of that articulation? Let's think deeply about this. Let's think about the other times that happens. How does that work? What does that do to the energy? And when you are willing to limit your focus to one thing, when I am willing to limit my focus to one thing, I notice that I can learn a lot about the construction of the music, about gain ideas for performance, um, and I find it very fruitful, at least for myself. We can also do this with vibrato. That's a really key one. Vibrato for me is one of the things that I have found can date me very critically in both good and not so good ways. And, I can have a very large, uh, healthy vibrato, shall we say, or, I've really trained myself in recent years to try and hone that in onto something more consistent, something more maybe refined. But the flexibility there is really important because I find both gorgeous and both, I should say, both aesthetics gorgeous and valuable and valued, and a lot to be valued there. And so I think even in the course of a piece like Iber, do I use fast vibrato for Iber? Do I use slow vibrato for Iber? Do I use no vibrato for Berio? Well, I don't know. The dogma of all of this is a little bit disconcerting at times, and I like the flexibility of being able to stretch it or condense it or speed it up or slow it down, make it sound this way or that way, like this instrument, that instrument, or just like a saxophone. It's all good. But we have to be a little bit, if we're going to, I find for myself, if I'm going to be offer a lot of variety, I have to find ways of anchoring that. Otherwise, it can sound quite random. And that's not expressive in my view for myself when it's just random. I find a lot more expression in the tension between variety and stability, variety and consistency, variety and planning, variety and also, like if we know this is the direction, like we're gonna go for a fast vibrato, then sure, in the moment if I'm feeling like super zippy, we'll just, you know, wiggle it on out, and that's fine. Like there's room for improvisation, but to have that film that is just about the one thing that I'm studying. So I'm not studying tone color when I'm studying vibrato. And it's not that, of course, that I don't care about it, but I'm really thinking if I want that big view while at the same time having the depth, I want to be able to limit my scope. And then, this is something that comes up in the Rasher book, Top Tones, in the context of, I think maybe it's long tones, thinking about dynamic consistency. There's a whole range of these different parameters. So if we apply that mindfully to the music that we're working on or to the scales that we're working on, I think, at least for me, it's been extremely valuable and also has helped me calm down the monkey brain enough to pay attention to actually get through a practice session and want to come back the next day or the next 25 minutes. So, you know, um, I'm also I'm just kind of getting to the end here of my prepared portion. And I'm also now again finding myself coming off of a major illness. In February, I became very ill and was on a medical leave. Um, and I want to thank Perry Roth for filling in for me with my studio. He did an amazing job, and my students were so lucky to work with him. And I must say, I've had a lot of support throughout the saxophone community during this period, whether it's from other performers with whom I had hoped to play but needed to cancel, or uh, other professors reaching out, seeing how they could support me and my students. I appreciate each and every one of you, and all of you who are here and all of you who are not here, for the community that this really, can be. Um, I'm just so grateful. And the thing about this illness was it was just prior to the start of Corona or the coronavirus. I guess it started, we don't really know when coronavirus started, but I found myself in a strange Rip Van Winkle world moment of waking up in a world of social distancing, um, of just all the pandemonium with the pandemic, and I have found as I've healed that I've been healing that I've been leaning really heavily on these practices. Again, I found myself unable to play. This time, the doctors told me that I would, it would be quite dangerous um, for me to even touch a saxophone. Well, not touch one, but really play one. And again, I found myself in this kind of dissociative state. I wouldn't say that. I think that means something clinically that I don't mean. Um, but I found myself separate from what I love to do. This time, that wasn't quite as hard for me as last time. I feel like my mindfulness practices that I developed since the concussion did help me just simply accept the current my current condition. That said, I did become very fearful of what's to come afterwards. What is this field going to be like for us, and for people who come next? What does it mean to be a musician today? What does it mean to be a musician next week? You know, practicing, like, all the gigs are canceled. They may be canceled for a long time. Um, what are the things that I actually care about as a musician? That has been a really fascinating question and one that has kept me up at night. Um, and you know, I am far from perfect with these mindfulness practices, but I was glad to be able to find something to come back to. I'm still not practicing full speed, but I am practicing every day, um, a little bit. And by every day, I think I mean the musician I practice every day, which means, except for a very few of us, almost every day. So I practice almost every day, not that much, but I am practicing at least one or two of these Pomodoro sessions each day. And I'm learning to be a little bit more flexible um, moving forward. And I really appreciate Nathan Nab and the series. It is an incredible series. I have learned so much coming to these very often at 3 o'clock Eastern Time, 2 o'clock Central, for these workshops. I've been so grateful. Um, and I'm so grateful to have a place to come and to share what's been going on, some thoughts, and if you have reflections of your own that might be beneficial to that you'd like to share, uh, maybe you're working on mindfulness practices or you have a thought about it. I'm going to stay online for the next 8 minutes, and feel free to put it in the chat. And also, if you have any questions about mindfulness, I talked about this from the context of my own personal performance. Um, but it's also something that I've been slowly learning to adapt for pedagogy, and I'm also happy to speak about that if that interests you. So thank you all very much, and I'll be here till 4/3/2/1, um, whatever time it is where you are. You're very welcome, Jan. It's nice to see you here. You're very welcome, Jeff. So the question is, I mentioned the insight timer. Is there a reason I've chosen that? Well, I think there are many timers probably. That's the first one that I found that was recommended to me. I can't remember who recommended it to me, but the thing I really like about it is the variety of sounds, and the sound's actually quite high quality. And I like listening to the bells, which is not something to be overlooked if you're going to be hearing them a lot, and you can change them. And with the paid version, which isn't that expensive, there's also a bunch of mindfulness. Um, um, there's guided meditations and things like that that can be quite nice. But mostly, and you can set presets, but mostly I really just like the sound of the gongs. I think they're quite nice. Julia says, what is the name of the mindfulness program? So I'm going to type this in here. It's mindfulness-based stress reduction is the name of that program. And it's offered by a lot of different practitioners across the country and across the United States and Canada and around the world. I think um, and I think right now it's amazing that everything is online. So I'm sure there are people meeting online as well. Thank you, Julia. I am feeling better. I hope you all are feeling okay. I haven't read actually any of Kabat-Zinn's books. Um, oh, I I have these books here that I wanted to show you. Okay, so um, well, most directly related to what you're talking about is this book, which is by Jack Kornfield, um, which I really like. It's about Buddhist psychology, and it's not particularly geared towards musicians or anything like that. But I think it's really a nice resource. And of course, it's Buddhist psychology, but it's really designed for Westerners and is not incompatible in any way, in my mind, with a scientific understanding of the world or anything like that. Um, so I think this is a great book. This is Wise Heart by Jack Kornfield. And there you go. There's one from Abigail Shepard. Wherever you go, there you are. Yes, I have heard of that one. Thank you so much for the recommendation. Um, and here's another one by that I saw on Facebook, thanks to Dan Grazer's Goodreads review. This one is called The Mindful Musician and Mental Skills for Peak Performance. This is Vanessa Cornett, um, who is Director of Keyboard Studies and Associate Professor of Music at the University of St. Thomas in Minneapolis, St. Paul. And it's released on Oxford University Press. And I've had a chance to start skimming through it, and it's a wonderful resource and book. Um, so I think that's it's quite interesting, um, and I highly recommend that. I also would say it's interesting though the subtitle "Mental Skills for Peak Performance." Actually sort of um, gets at, of course, one of the initial reasons, things that drew me towards mindfulness was how I can be the best classical saxophonist I could possibly be. And, you know, just going through the story that I told you about what's happened with me, of course, I want to be the best saxophonist I can be. I try to do that every day that I show up to the practice room. And at the same time, driving it now instead of through peak performance, driving it now through integration and mindfulness itself, I find a little bit more grounding for me personally. So that is far from a slam on the book. I highly recommend it. I'm looking forward to reading the whole thing. Um, but I thought it was just kind of an interesting note when I picked it up. So there's a question that's come in about struggling. When I struggle with focus during the practice sessions, how long do I continue to try to remain productive before I put down my horn and move on to something else? And that's a great question. I don't have a set amount, um, but I do recognize that I think here's okay. I think the best answer I can give you is that um, when I notice that I am engaging in, let me see here. So the three things that are in this Wise Heart book that are part of Buddhist philosophy and psychology are that these ideas of grasping, aversion, and delusion. Um, and there's detailed explanations of those available on the internet and in the Wise Heart. So grasping, aversion, and delusion. And I think what I ideally try to do is with my mindfulness practice, notice if I'm engaging in any of these in relationship to my practice and um, I try to see, if I'm engaging with any of those during the practice, and I try to work with, through, and around those using some of the skills that I have. And if I find that I continue to grasp for really more than two full sessions, and I'm not able to find another way through, um, then I do stop. Um, you know, that's kind of ideal. I've also, of course, stopped right away, and I've, of course, stopped 6 hours in, and you know, it's all good. I think really the practice is for me to just try to notice what I did last time and this time and what I'm doing, and just try to come back, whenever I can to something to the practice again. And it's possible if I'm engaged in those kinds of behaviors that I'm or thinking I might need to practice something else, like have a formal mindfulness practice rather than a formal practice, music practice. So, hi Giovanna. Could I talk about what sort of strategies I use right before a big performance? Okay, so yeah, right before a big performance. So, right before a big performance is I'm usually trying to calm my breath, and I try to call on some of these quick techniques like the body scan, a 1 minute body scan, which actually has a great side thing. If you can get good at it, um, and you can do it quickly, you can do it backstage, and nobody has to know, or if they do know, whatever. Um, but you can run through that, and so I try to do that. I do a little bit of like tapping on both sides of my body. I find that calming, um, and I try to just try to get centered and use some of these practices right before. But in leading up for a big performance, I think there's a couple things that I like to do. One is I like to, if I can, try to hear the whole performance in my head before I go out on stage. So that would mean maybe a day or two before lying down and just listening in my head and making mental note of any spots that I can't quite clearly hear, um, and going through those um, the next day, actually in the practice room. Um, but I try to hear the whole thing, and I try to feel the way I walk out on the stage. I try to hear the talking, the words that I'm going to say, and the kind of energy that I'm bringing to that. I want to hear and feel all of that in advance. And then it's like I've already done the performance. This is an old technique. I know Louis Armstrong did this. So many other people do this. But I think that's a really nice kind of preparation. And the other one is while I'm practicing, sometimes I will practice expanding my awareness beyond the chatter in my head. So rather than try to exclude it or squash it or put that monkey in a cage, I try to expand my mind and awareness enough that the monkey can be chattering away and I can still play fine. And if I have that ability and I have um, uh, the proper preparation in advance from a purely technical standpoint, I don't tend to get as nervous. So I would say it's a multi-part answer, but that's the range that I use in preparation. Well, I think we're at the end of the hour. I want to thank all of you and those who have left. Thank you so much for coming. And I hope to see and meet all of you um, sometime in the future in person. If you have further questions, feel free to reach out to me. My email is a great way to do that. But of course, if any other way is also fine. So thank you all and stay safe, stay healthy, and take good care.